Stephen, welcome to Future Whenua Summit. You're doing so much work out in the world and creating change and leading by example and steering our society in a healthy direction. So I want to recognize the work that you do. And I just want to start with a question about what do you see on the horizon that we could be focusing our attention upon?
Well, kia ora koto, ko Stephen toko ingoa. Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you virtually like this. I think, we're at a really interesting moment in time. And it's important to remember that what has life been like in the past doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the same in the future. And I think sometimes we can be like fish in the fishbowl. We assume that the water that we're swimming in is just the way it's always been. But I think that the future will be different. And the question is whether we will move from what I would call an extractive economy or approach towards a more regenerative economy or approach. And to me, that's really, in a way, summed up by the fact that if you went back a few hundred years, there was no such thing as a company. Like, they are fictions, legal fictions. They don't exist really. You can't meet a company in the same way that a person exists. And I think that's encouraging because we can reshape what the future will be as well if we're not willing to settle for what we have today. So that's what I do a lot of talking about, is paradigm shifts of thinking as we move from old conceptions to new ways of doing things. In my mind, this is summed up in a movement which some people call social enterprise, the idea that companies could actually move from being purely profit-focused to being purpose-focused, with profit as sustainability being key. So you have profit and you have purpose. I think that's what the future is really going to hold. And this moment in time that we're in, I think we'll look back on and say, back in the 2020s, that was the time that they were starting to really articulate this better and starting to think about companies and other structures from a much longer term perspective, where we're actually thinking about what's the purpose and impact rather than how much profits can we make.
That's awesome, man. I absolutely agree that that's a part of where we need to be thinking as we plan our steps forward, is this broader shift from a egocentric perspective where you're really looking out for personal gain and those directly around you, and changing that up for a more ethnocentric worldview where you're thinking of others and right out as far as that can extend, and obviously including the whenua, which is what we're focusing on. So I'm wondering, you mentioned social enterprise. Is there a way that we can do business on the land using this new model?
I think there is. In my mind, when you look at legal structures, I don't really mind if people have trusts or companies or incorporated societies or cooperative companies. I think they can all be used. The question for any founder or anybody listening to this is being clear on your purpose and your mission. And if you can articulate that clearly, then I think you can start moving in a direction which will be much more generative and much more focused on a wider set of stakeholders. So in my mind, it's all about being clear on the impact and the purpose, what it is that you're trying to do. And absolutely, I think for people who have land holdings or they're in farming, this is a huge opportunity. This is a perfect time to be much clearer about our impact and our purpose and what it is that we're doing. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it involves a bit of hard work, because you have to actually ask yourself some hard questions and say, beyond the next 2 years, beyond the next 5 years, what's our 50-year plan? What's our 100-year plan? But when you start thinking of it in terms of principles like stewardship or kaitiakitanga, all of a sudden, if you're a steward of the land, if you're a guardian of the land, it's going to frame things in a much different way of looking at what you do. And I think that's the challenge and the opportunity, is to think in this much longer term perspective. And in my mind, that's really what social enterprise is about, because the short term 1980s Western conception of capitalism is greed is good. How much profits can I extract? This resource is there for me to be mined or exploited. That's the way that has been, put forward as the best way for business. And what we're talking about is reimagining business, reimagining it through the lens of purpose and impact, which says through this company or this structure, we can actually have a greater impact than just focusing on how much profit can we extract, how much more money can we put into our bank account. So that's, to me, it's a perfect time for people involved in agriculture to be looking at this. And I am seeing people looking at it. I'll send you the link to this little book, Laying Foundations for Reimagining Business, which I just put out recently. And I've had interest from all sectors, including farming sector and, agriculture. And it's something that I think captures the imagination once you start thinking in that, with that perspective or that lens of, well, wait a minute, it's about more than just you and me. It's about more than our bank account. It's about how we can actually respond and empower a whole set of stakeholders. So yeah.
Awesome. I can't wait to get my hands on that book. I guarantee it's full of gold.
I'll send you a copy. I think I've got your address. So it's a free download, and I recorded it as an audio book as well. So anybody can just listen as they're driving somewhere.
All right, man. That's quite the offering. And it lines up very well. Reimagining business. I guess part of what the conversation we're here having at Future Whenua is reimagining kaitiakitanga, reimagining land stewardship, and really taking a look at what opportunities lie and what the mindset shift is going to have to, come with it. You talked about it's got to be driven by purpose, and we've got this beautiful Māori concept of kaupapa. How does one connect with their purpose? Is it given by God when they're born? Is it something that just gets pieced together by their upbringing? How does it come about, and how can one cultivate that in themselves?
That's a really great question. And I can, in some ways, offer myself as an example of what I think the answer is, because I started my career, I have an accent, but I actually grew up in New Zealand. I went to Canterbury University. I started my career at a big law firm, about 400 people in Wellington. And then I left New Zealand and worked for a bigger law firm, 4,000 lawyers in 55 offices. And I was doing mergers and acquisitions. The biggest deal was about $4 billion deal, like massive, huge infrastructure, gold mines, you name it. I was helping to buy and sell it. So when I look at the first half of my life, the first half of my career, I would say that I would not have been able to have this conversation. So I think it is a lot about opening yourself up and allowing yourself to be curious and being willing to explore resources and thinking of other people and be challenged by it. It's not easy, but once you do that, it's definitely possible to learn and educate yourself and grow in this area. And that's the beauty of being a human, I think. If you compare us with other life forms, trees are beautiful, but I don't see them picking up a book to read, like we have brains which can actually change over time. So I would definitely say this is more on the nurture side rather than the nature side. I think we can be taught, we can learn, and we can grow. And that's actually one reason I started that podcast called Seeds, because interviewing people is a great way to learn from them. So I've done 300 interviews with people about their life stories. And that then hopefully helps the listeners to question their own beliefs and their own ways of doing things. So absolutely, it can be learned. The key is being curious.
Brilliant. And Yeah, there's a three-letter question, and it's why, and you can ask yourself that, and then you can ask yourself again and again, and by the time you get to 3 or 4 cycles of why, and then you've got a pry underneath, why is that important, you can really unpack some pretty powerful message that it's coming from somewhere.
Mm.
300 podcast episodes is an incredible feat. Good on you for that. Is there some themes that have arisen through that journey, and as well as the themes, are there some specific examples of people you've talked to that are working in this field of land stewardship?
Yeah, there are, for sure. I would say the themes question, I think it does come back to this idea that if we're clear on our purpose and our mission, then everything else kind of flows from that. And I think too often people are unclear on their purpose and their mission. And so they float from thing to thing, and they haven't really done the hard work of being articulate. So for me, being clear about what I'm doing and how I go about doing it and why do I do it. There's this great video, which we can maybe share as a link with your people watching, by Simon Sinek, who looks at the power of why. And if you can understand the why, then the how and the what will flow. But if you don't know your why, then the how and the what are going to always be confused. So I think these are kind of basic principles, but being clear on purpose, impact, mission, that's the way forward. And if more of us are able to do that, then I think we'll find that we're able to achieve a lot more with the time that we've been given. Yeah, for me as well, it's definitely, this is kind of a personal thing, but it's definitely realizing that we're only on Earth for a short time. You're going to blink and you're going to be 80. It goes by so quickly. So how are we using each day, each hour? How are we using it to help other people, inspire other people to become more than what they are? And then as for your the topics, one I would encourage people to listen to, not in the land stewardship type of area, but Israel Cooper was an amazing interview. So he set up a building company that's called Home. But he focuses in particularly on sort of community housing and social housing type of building. But he shared his story, and if you are, some of you will already maybe have jumped there. His surname Cooper, his grandfather was the founder of Gloriavale. So he described leaving Gloriavale as a young child and coming out of that circumstance, and then how that has influenced his own life. So it's a really powerful one on the impact of purpose and being clear on it. Yeah, and then there's several, what might be easiest is if I send you some links to the best podcast episodes where we're talking about the future of sort of land and how it's used. There was a great one with Martin Large from the UK. So he's all about land trusts in the UK that then own land and make it available for the public to access. So that was a really good one. The one with Camilla Young, that was an amazing one about using land to create co-housing sort of solutions, and using her skills as an architect to think about the importance of buildings on the people. We think of a building as a building, but it's a lot more. It's almost a living thing itself. So there's been several that would be relevant to people, I think.
Yeah, I'd absolutely receive those suggestions and attach them down below. Would you want to just take a slightly deeper dive on that community housing, since you've been involved in that? Because I think it's really of the deepest nature in answer to this, question about how can we best use the land moving forward.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's a big issue, as we all know. I mean, just the basic thing that house prices have gone up like what, 40% in the last year. It's just a crazy thing when you think about it. And I'm sure some of the people who are watching this have young children, and you're looking at young children, and if the average house price is $1 million, who's going to be able to afford anything? But for me, the social housing has been a real, something I think that we need to do better on. So this is people who are potentially living in their vans or their cars, or they're just homeless, or they're on a couch. There's no access for them to housing. It's just, there's no emergency housing available. And actually the last I saw it, I think there was about 27,000 people on the emergency housing list in New Zealand. So we like to think of ourselves as a pretty advanced nation, right? Pat ourselves on the back, but we're not doing that great when it comes to providing housing for our most vulnerable. So and this is a good outworking. I only offer it as an example of the potential. So about 2 years ago, I helped with the setting up of community finance. So I'm now the chair of the board of that company. We have some amazing people on the board, including Shamubil Yakub, who's an economist that some of you may have seen on TV or in the newspaper, and Campbell Roberts, who's been involved with Salvation Army for decades. And what we're basically doing is operating as an impact company. So purpose is our driver, but we need profits to be sustainable. So we're not ignoring one or the other. And what we do is issue bonds, which kind of sit in the middle here. And we're connecting investors who have money with philanthropic, with social housing projects. So those are often run by Salvation Army or other community housing providers. They know how to build the housing, but they don't have access to the money very easily. The investors have the money, but don't know how to build the housing. So in a way, we're like a dating app in the middle, connecting the investors with the opportunities. And when I start talking, people sometimes assume, great, you've raised what, $50,000, $200,000, like that would be amazing if you had. But actually in 2 years, we've raised $93 million. So that's all investment coming through bonds to then build social housing. So that's a pretty cool thing. These people are like Tyndall Foundation, their Lindsay Foundation, and then some KiwiSaver funds like Pathfinder, Generate, Simplicity. So KiwiSaver funds that have that broader term horizon. And this is really a movement, which some of your people watching may or may not be familiar with, but I'll introduce you to the idea of impact investing. So the investors are looking at the opportunity to get financial return, which they do get, but they also have impact through whatever it is that's being built or created. So it's kind of a new conception, a new way of thinking, that it's not just financial return, it's also about the mahi, the purpose, the impact that we can have. So I offer that as one example. The other example I would give in a land sort of space is a group that I've been working with in Takaka in Golden Bay. And what they've done is bought around a 15-hectare block just outside of Takaka. So if you're headed towards the ocean outside of Takaka, it's kind of near the school, the primary school there. And what they're doing is kind of two parts. The first part, which is really amazing, is building a village, which will be full of tiny houses. So very minimalist, small places, but perfectly functional and beautiful, you know, great, good design, clean, green, energy efficient, all of those things. The second thing that they're doing is regenerating the land. So obviously they're not going to use the whole 15 acres for just this eco village. So they are going to be planting in natives. They're going to be regenerating the whenua around the village. So that then can also become an outreach, because people can come to visit the village. They can go and see the land, which is now has new growth coming up. So it's this really beautiful synergy between a social housing, community housing, eco-village concept and the regeneration nature aspect. So I really love that there's a real synergy there. So if any of you people who are listening have land, these would be things to explore. Just in terms of the legal side, because it may interest some people, what we've done there is actually set up a charitable trust, which is then running the whole project. And we went in under the grounds of being regeneration of the environment and nature, and also aspects which are about the co-housing and the providing places for people to live. But regeneration of nature is the principal thing. So yeah, just some practical examples that impact investing is real. And if you have land, there are ways that you can think broader about how you use it.
Yeah, that's awesome. This idea of a ecological village, it's really stacking a bunch of solutions in one, isn't it? And yeah, I think underlying some of the issues that we've talked about and that just await out there is this disconnection from nature, and the way that we're living is just, can be so far removed from what it means to be a being on this earth. And if we can, make that sort of major transition, well, what sort of major transitions are going to happen internally as well, in terms of that story that we're telling ourselves and our purpose in being here. Impact
Well, I think it's
investment.
a really important point. Can I just pick up on that? Because this is storytelling, right? Like, we need to tell our stories well. And I think if you think about humanity, until even a few hundred years ago, most of the people that we're descended from could not read or write. And it was all oral tradition. We told stories sitting around the fire, talking about what had happened that day. And I think stories is something that we've lost sight of within our digital culture of clickbait and moving to the next headline. And if we can come back and really tell authentic, meaningful stories about where we're from, what we do, and why we do it, it's going to connect with a lot more people, and it's going to have much greater impact. So exploring how you tell your story is a really important skill to have, I think.
Yeah, no one wants to be the bad guy in the story, eh? So if you're practicing telling your story, and then you've sort of got to envision it and use that, creative capacity, and it's like, oh yeah, well, maybe those are principles that I want to embody more in myself, or maybe that is a path that I'd like to steer my personal story down towards. Yeah, I just wanted to tap back into the impact investing, and it sounds incredible, the entity that you're a part of. And so if that's for co-housing, is there, how would a regenerative or rural or entrepreneur find access to capital? Say someone's wanting to do a market gardening which teaches people about biochar, or they've got a petting zoo that adds experience as well as doing production, so they've got this sort of business entity, but they're really trying to progress this movement.
Well, it's not really legal advice, but it's all about people and connections and telling your story, getting to the right people. So I guess my first question would be, is which region are you in? Where are you in the Hawke's Bay? Are you down near Queenstown? Are you in Nelson? Like, who are the local people that you can get on board? And all across the country, there's what are called angel groups. So these are investors who usually have sold their startups, sold their businesses, usually have some money available. And angel groups are actually a good way to get connection with people who might be willing to invest in a new concept or idea. So if anyone's interested, I'm a member of Angel Association of New Zealand. Like, I know a lot of people in that, but I know there's a Canterbury Angels, there's a Marlborough Angels, there's Wellington, Auckland, Tauranga, they're all over. So I guess looking for groups where there would be aligned people. Generally, honestly speaking, what they're looking to do is invest in like software companies where they're gonna 100 times their investment. But it's the networks, and those people also are often looking at how can they have impact? How could they give back in some way? So, if there was a project on a farm or on land that was doing that, those would be the places to be going door knocking and ask around. There's a vast network across New Zealand, and I view it more and more where we each think that we're individuals, little dots, all there but not connected. That's not true. We are connected. It's like a big giant spider web, and in a good way. And that, I know you, and you know that person, and that person knows that person. So it's about using that network and using that as a means to find aligned investors and aligned stakeholders, because that's really important. You don't want to get people who are just investing for the financial return. You need to get people who are on the journey with you.
Mm. There's a couple sort of roadblocks that we've bumped into time and time as aspiring land-based entrepreneurs, and one is just this thing of, my background as a farmer doesn't exactly lead me into the amount of due diligence and really sort of paper hoop jumping that's been required to get there, and so I'm just wondering, is for someone that's doing a tech startup, they might be a little more inclined into following those steps, whereas someone who's into, growing a food forest might be less inclined. So that's something, a challenge that I've seen. And another is just this, we can get 100 or 1,000 or much more than that time return on a technology project. We're not going to get that on something like a food forest, because it's slow and it's time, and it's going to build the soil, and it's going to have all these ripple effects that we are hard to quantify, but it's going to be hard to excite an investor about that. And yet at a time when the disparity between the wealth is, the wealth gap is really getting centralized towards some of these tech giants and people in that arena, and it comes at the sap of the people on the land. It can feel that way, at least. And so there's a couple questions there, and you answer them in two different ways if you could. And so one is just like, for what could ease the process for someone who struggles with the paperwork hoop jumping, and then if you could lead into something about just like what might be a solution to this shifting of wealth away from the rural areas, when really we need to be enriching our rural areas, and that takes capital.
Yeah, no, these are great questions. I think I would encourage people who are listening that there are resources out there, and there are free resources. So you're going to have to do a bit of homework if you want to understand this. But, I wrote a guide about impact investing in New Zealand, and I can send you the link, and it's a free download. It's like 12 pages, I think, written with the Center for Social Impact up in Auckland. So there's that guide. There's a guide about setting up legal entities. There's lots of resources, is my point, is that you just have to kind of make the effort to reach out. And it all of this has mainly been done before. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. These friends in Takaka, they've done this now. It's wonderful, because it can be a template for other people to say, I'd love to do some sort of an eco-village and regenerative project. How could I do it? Well, it's been done. So I think sometimes you think that it's never been done, but actually once you investigate, usually there are examples of people who are pushing the boundaries. Yeah. And then I think the encouraging thing is that, I started the conversation with, this is a moment in time, and there's paradigm shifts of thinking. And I think that that's actually true. I'm not just making it up. I think if you are wanting to land on this side of the equation, then you're also going to be landing on the right side of history, because people will look back and they will, be encouraged by those who were willing to look into impact investing and look into doing food forests or whatever it is, because it's that longer term perspective. So I think you will find your tribe if you persist and you keep trying and you're motivated. And I think you will find that people who do have money and wealth will get interested if you can tell your story well. So the answer, maybe part of this, is that you actually have to put a bit of money on the table, and get somebody who's really good at telling stories to help you tell the story of what you want to do. You might have to put some money on the table to get an accountant to run through the figures with you to work out what's going to work. You might have to put some money on the table to get a lawyer to help you think through what's the best legal structure going to be. But those aren't insurmountable things if you're approaching it from the perspective of a long-term vision. You know, like hopefully we're catching up in 40 years and we're looking back at the video of this conversation and we're thinking about all the projects that people who watched it went on to start. So it's going to be hard work. It's not like you can just walk into a mainstream bank and get the money to do this. But if it's worth doing, then it's worth doing well, and it's worth finding the right people who can invest in it and be on the journey with you.
That's awesome advice, man. And yeah, it's something that space that we're trying to step into with Future Whenua. We established a charitable trust last year after the inaugural summit, and we're really asking this question about, okay, so we've put on this event and we've started this conversation about the direction we can head and as a rural sector. And we're really just reflecting on, so what's the biggest hole we can service? And it was just through our journey as rural entrepreneurs and the struggles we've had, and just the difference between an urban setting and a rural. And so yeah, we're only young at this stage, and we've been focusing on the summit and a few of our internal projects, but where we're hoping to get to is a place where we could really support a budding solution here with an idea that can use the land to progress society in a positive way.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think it's much more aligned with the concept that we're moving maybe away from individuality and a Western conception, which places the person at the center. You know, like I actually think there's fundamental philosophical problems with that, where it's all about how much can I make out of this situation? And it's more of an embracing the collective. In a way, if you look at Te Ao Māori, the idea of a community, you know, coming together, it's a much more holistic way of looking. And if you start thinking of the land not as something that you own, but something that you've been entrusted with, then that changes your conception quite dramatically, I think. And for me, it's put up in a phrase, which is, we are not inheritors of wealth from the past to be used by us. We are guardians of the future for our children. And kind of that difference in mindset then helps you to do the hard work. Because let's be honest, some of this is hard work. To have that bigger conception of what you're aiming for and trying to achieve. Yeah.
It's awesome, man. And yeah, it's this idea about being a taupuna, being an ancestor. So we can reflect on our ancestor and the great achievements. When we started this call, I was sitting outside underneath an oak tree that my grandfather planted, and then you think, oh, actually right now I'm an ancestor for my future descendant. And through that lens, it can definitely aid that, you know, story we were telling about finding your why. It's like, oh, okay, because I'm leaving something. Yeah, so being a tupuna. Are there any
I found
other
it
lessons?
helpful. I do, this podcast, I called it Seeds. And the reason that I called it Seeds, that's the sort of the logo. The reason I called it Seeds is the idea that seeds, they look like they're dead, you know, they're not moving. But if you plant them and you give them the right conditions, water, light, you know, warmth, nutrients, all of those things mean that that dead looking thing can spring to life. So for me, these conversations on the podcast, they're like seeds, and they go out into the world. And I don't know who listens to them. I know it's been listened to about 140,000 times at the moment. So that's a lot of people have listened to it, but I don't see the result immediately. But they are like seeds to me. And hopefully one day, 10 years from now, someone will come back and say, I really liked that interview. It affected my perspective and I switched my job, or whatever it is. And so the point is that if we view our lives like seeds, if we view what we do like seeds, then everything matters. And I love this quote don't count each day by what you harvest, count it by how many seeds you sow. So in other words, you're not seeing the immediate results today, but you're planting the seeds. And this is great for all of you watching. I'm sure you know that you don't see the result, the next Tuesday or the next Friday. It takes time. And these things that we're talking about, these are deep principles, and they take time to outwork. And it might be, my dream would be that our great-grandchildren sit down one day 100 years from now, when you and I are no longer on this planet, and they watch a video like this and go, I'm kind of proud of my tupuna, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. Look at what he was talking about back in 2022. Imagine back then what it was like,
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, holding that sort of outward. You're working for everyone, but then if you're going to do something egoic, let it be to your legacy. Let it to be what you leave behind. And yeah, the idea of the seed. It's within a seed is the latent potential for a plant, and then a guild of plants, and then a whole ecosystem. Really, is held within a seed. So it's a great name. And your podcast does do a great job of unleashing that.
Yeah. So what I'll do is send you some links to things, and then you can put them up with the notes or circulate them to people. But like I say, there's a lot of information out there. The way I access information at the moment is I have a commute, so it's only about 20 minutes. But if I listen to things on double speed, I can listen to a whole podcast episode driving in and out to my house from work to home. So there's ways that you can hack the system and get access to lots of content that will help you expand your mind.
Let's say everything on your plate just got taken care of, or there was a second Stephen Moe that can do the role that you're filling, and you're completely free of time, and you are set to the task of making land transition easier. How would you go about doing that? What would it be, and what would the organization or entity or just output look like in 5 years' time?
Well, part of it, I think, would just be having these sorts of conversations. That's why I really welcome the chance to talk with you, because I'm reading a lot at the moment. There's a book called New Power, and it's really good. I did a book review of it. And basically, it's saying the old ways of thinking about power and how we change society was you have to have a hierarchical view. So it all comes from the government trickling down. It comes from the big companies trickling down. And New Power is saying, actually, it comes from movements that start at the grassroots. And, like yours, Future Whenua, it starts by people gathering, and then it grows from there. And all of a sudden, the movement becomes bigger than you could have imagined. And an example of that would be like Black Lives Matter. It didn't exist a couple of years ago, and yet it was all of a sudden everywhere. And it was because people cared and they started spreading it, rather than some central organization saying, this is what we're going to do. It was from the ground up. So I think the more conversations we can have like this at a very grassroots level, the better, because that's how over time opinions shift and change. So I think I would be just trying to get out, speak to as many people as I can, empower them with knowing that they can change their lives too, in the same way that I did 6 years ago. I couldn't have talked like this. So you can change too. I was 39, I'm 45 now. What am I going to do with the next 20 years of my working career? How can I use it to maybe suggest new legal structures that will be much more generative? That's kind of what excites me.
Do you think, what steps would you take? Say it was, getting to that wealth redistribution that we're talking. There's so much capital out there, and yet it's a real pinch for someone to get $5,000 for a new regenerative project. Is there some way of connecting that, or?
Well, what I'd like to see is a new legal structure that sits between charity and company. So for profit, not for profit. I don't like those terms anyway, because it's so binary. It's you're either this or that. So I'd like to see something in the middle that actually offered tax concessions for companies that were focused on impact and purpose. So in your example, you've set up as a charity, which is an awesome alternative. But what if you'd been able to set up as an impact company, which had tax concessions the same way a charity does, but which also was able to have investors investing into it, issuing shares. So you're getting the best of company structure and the best of charitable trust structure. So if you're asking me what the future might hold, I hope that that one day would be a commonplace thing. And I have great hope that it could be. I look at England and they have something called a community interest company. So it would be some sort of a variation like that. Yeah, but why not dream big? What if Aotearoa was able to introduce a new legal structure? Remember, hundreds of years ago, there were no companies. We completely made them up. They're a fiction. So let's just make up a new fiction, which is focused on purpose and impact and rewards entrepreneurs, is able to get investment and moves forward, you know, into a more regenerative economy.
Awesome. That's a big and beautiful vision. Okay, so that's on the business end. You're a politician. You're the business chamber. You're a lawmaker, and you get to make some new laws around land use, business structures, whatever it might be. What would be one law that you'd like to introduce?
Well, I actually think that basically the way we view land is too much focused from a Western conception. And, you know, who owns the land? Well, what's the name on the certificate of title, right? Like that's how we think about land. It's very, that's my land, you know, it's on a piece of paper and it's there. And I actually look at some of the concepts that are introduced by the principles of papakainga. So that's more of a communal approach to housing and land. And I think there's a lot that we could learn from that. And if that could become a bit more mainstreamed. So basically this is, you know, 4 or 5 houses all built together with communally shared areas. So there might be, you know, a picnic area and communal garden area. And it's all a community focus. So within a Te Ao Māori perspective, it's called papakainga. But couldn't we adopt something like that in a more, you know, Western way to emphasize community? I think that would be really interesting to explore.
I would love to see that come into effect. Absolutely. What other lessons have you learned from Te Ao Māori? You've mentioned a few: papakainga, kaekitangi.
Yeah. Well, in this book, there's actually a chapter that I co-wrote with somebody up in Auckland. And he's Maori, so we did it together because I think it is important not to do things because you think it's ticking a box or something. So in this chapter, we talked about different principles, even manakitanga, you know, looking after other people and welcoming them. Kaitiakitanga, the guardianship, stewardship, I think in a land principles, that's a really powerful one. Yeah, and then I'm really fortunate at the moment. I'm on the board of something which is a charitable trust set up by Nuk Korako, who was the MP for Banks Peninsula until quite recently. And we're focusing on basically the papakainga type concepts around land and ownership. And could we introduce this to iwi across the country? So yeah, I'm on a learning journey. I'm the only Pakeha on that trust board. So it's a great experience to, you know, start a board meeting with a karakia and, you know, a prayer to begin. It's very different from a Western, like, okay, what's agenda item 3.7?
That's awesome, man. Good on you for being on that path. I've just started my learning journey to understand Te Ao Māori a bit better. I'm doing a tikanga course through Te Wānanga, so I'm pretty excited about
cool.
what the year has in store for me.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for the opportunity to share with
Okay.
you. Maybe should I just finish off by saying thanks for the chance to share. I obviously haven't met everybody who's watching this, but hopefully you get the sense that I'm an accessible type of person. So I'm really keen to see new projects coming about. I've been involved in a number of different ones. So I'm always happy to, I mentioned the commute. I'm always happy to have phone calls with people who'd like to bounce ideas around, particularly if you're looking at starting new things. That kind of excites me, like what could the future hold? So I'll send you the links for the podcast and things, but it's been a pleasure to share with you. And I wish that the people at the conference have a really great time and really cement relationships that will last in the coming years.
It's been a pleasure indeed, Stephen. And yeah, I've been drawing so many similarities to how you've detailed social enterprise and what I've seen in the regenerative agriculture movement. It's not necessarily a set of protocols or a structure. It's about changing your why and changing your mindset around what you're doing, and broadening out who you're trying to impact with that. So it's been great to hear from you. Have a brilliant evening, and I can't wait to reconnect and get through some of the resources you've shared.
Great, thank you.
Man, cheers, Stephen.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, that was fun. Thank you for the chance. So just let me know if it's up or if you want me to help promote what you're doing. I'm always happy to. And you should come on the podcast sometime. Maybe if I like to do the interviews in person, just because I think you get a special, connection if you're together. So if you're passing through Christchurch, let me know and we can set it up.
Cool, man. Yeah, I'd love to do that. Yeah, there's sort of another reason I was outside. I just being in, yeah, I'm not an indoors guy, that's for sure, and I'm definitely more of an in-person guy as well. It's so
well, good on you
and
for doing what you're doing.
Yeah,
good on you for doing what you're doing, because I think that whole sector, it needs people to step up and ask questions and get people curious. And that's what I was trying to emphasize. Like, the answers are there if you're willing to go on that journey. So yeah,
they are there indeed. And yeah, I've connected to my purpose on a very deep level. Like I've done that exercise of why, and I've sort of set my target of where I'd like to go. And yeah, it's a long journey ahead and an exciting one.
Cool, that's great.
I'd like to talk to you some specific as well when we do catch up about just a community housing project we've got here. I do think community is a fundamental solution, and we've got something out here, a cluster of houses around a shared facility. It's exactly what we have in mind, this sort of six honeycomb sections around a center one. I'd love to run you through it at some point.
Sure, no problem. Cool. Well, have a good evening yourself. We'll catch up in due course.